My name is Anna. I'm a 32-year-old working housewife, living with my husband and son. I joined the company I currently work for as a fresh graduate, and this year marks my 10th year with them. I took maternity leave when I gave birth, but I returned to work when my son turned 1, and I am still actively working in sales. My hard work is starting to pay off, and I'm close to getting a promotion, which is making work even more enjoyable recently. My husband, who is 3 years younger than me, is the exact opposite and has been changing jobs repeatedly since before we got married. As a future entrepreneur, he believes it's necessary for him to learn various skills at different companies rather than staying in one place. But in reality, his salary keeps decreasing with each job change. I have my doubts about whether he's truly improving his skills, but I was willing to support our family financially and encourage his dream. I wanted to believe and support my husband's dream. However, he betrayed me. He was trying to set me up in the most terrible, unthinkable way. For about the first 2 years of our marriage, things went well between us. But with my husband's unstable work situation, we were never financially stable. Still, living with my husband, who would talk about dreams after starting up his business, like building our own house and traveling abroad, was enjoyable. My husband started to change around the time I gave birth to our son. He clearly started acting cold towards me. Looking back, my husband may not have changed that much. Perhaps the birth of our child made me start to notice his true nature. He never did any housework to begin with, and he seemed to hate raising kids even more. While it was fine when I was on maternity and childcare leave, when I returned to work, things became busier than I had imagined. I would prepare breakfast for the whole family early in the morning and drop our child off at the daycare center. After work, I would rush to the daycare center, stop by at the supermarket, and prepare dinner. There was no time to catch my breath, and I was just busy every single day. Despite seeing how busy I was, my husband ignored it. Although my husband had more time, he refused to take our child to daycare, something I thought he could do. His reason was that he didn't want to be thought of as a person with too much time on their hands by others if he did things like picking up and dropping off our child at daycare. Despite being appalled at my husband's self-consciousness, I tried to persuade him that he is overthinking things, and it has become an era where fathers also take care of their children as well. In fact, I see many fathers in suits picking up and dropping off their children. However, no matter how much I explained, my husband refused. It seemed like it would turn into a fight if I said any more, so I eventually gave up. I worked hard at housework and childcare while going to work early in the morning and working overtime, all for the sake of my beloved family. Although it would have been helpful if there were someone to warn my husband who didn't help at all, and my father-in-law was the only person my husband was afraid of, but he was working away from home. My father-in-law, who understood my job well, always praised me for balancing housework and work. My husband continued to act freely even after finding out about my pregnancy. "Take better care of Anna," he would advise my husband. However, my father-in-law was transferred far away just after my son was born. Although my mother-in-law stayed at their home, she spoiled her son and was completely on my husband's side, which was not helpful at all. My mother-in-law, who had a long history of being a housewife, didn't seem to think highly of me as I continued to work after giving birth. In addition to that, she was probably worried about her son, who kept changing jobs and was not successful. She seemed to be frustrated with me, who was achieving more at work than her own son. Every time I met with my mother-in-law, she would make sarcastic comments, telling me not to just work but to fulfill my role as a wife and mother. My mother-in-law should understand that we can't maintain our current lifestyle just on my husband's income. Furthermore, her remarks gradually escalated, saying things like, "It's sad to leave the child in the daycare until very late, or that I should quit my job. Perhaps because my father-in-law was away from home for work for a long time, my mother-in-law had too much time on her hands. She would casually come to our house, make sarcastic comments, and then go home. Being blamed one-sidedly was mentally tough, but I had almost given up on being understood by people with old-fashioned thoughts like my mother-in-law. However, it turned out that my husband was also annoyed with my success at work. When my efforts were recognized and I got a raise, the only response I got when I reported it to my husband was a, "Huh." I felt sad that he couldn't even say congratulations. Furthermore, he started saying things like, "Don't get carried away just because you're earning a little more than me." What on earth am I working so hard for every day? I couldn't endure the days of being sarcastically criticized by both my husband and mother-in-law. And I even began to regret marrying my husband. Then my husband started coming home late bit by bit. Although he sometimes gets home late at around midnight, he was working at a factory where he's supposed to finish work within the business hours. Whenever I ask why he's so late, he simply says he was working. I didn't believe him, but he quickly becomes upset when I question him for more details. Therefore, even though I was suspicious of my husband's unusual behavior, I didn't ask him any further. And then an incident occurred amidst all this. One night, my mother-in-law suddenly came over for a visit. I was used to her coming over unannounced, but that particular day was rather depressing. The reason was that there was a sports day at the daycare since the afternoon, and I had been staying up late and had made a lunchbox early in the morning, which had made me tired, so I wanted to rest early. Furthermore, I had an important business negotiation coming up the next day. My son seemed to be tired from the sports day as well and started dozing off immediately after dinner, and by the time my mother-in-law came, he was already asleep in the bedroom. However, I couldn't go to sleep. I had to serve tea to my mother-in-law who had arrived, so I dragged my exhausted body towards the kitchen. Then, all of a sudden, my husband grabbed my arm tightly. Surprised, I looked at him and he said, "You're tired, let me do it." I was astonished, as my husband rarely cooks. Even when I'm tired, he hardly ever helps out with cooking or cleaning. Maybe he just wanted to show his good side to his mother. Thinking he was all talk, I ignored his words and headed towards the kitchen. However, he wouldn't let go of my arm. Then he forcefully made me sit on the sofa, saying in a louder voice, "I told you to rest." With such sudden action from him, I was at a loss. If my husband serves the tea, my mother-in-law will surely criticize me again. She will undoubtedly grumble something like, "Even though you're the wife, you let your husband serve the tea." But I was surprised when my mother-in-law also said, "Anna, just sit down," while holding me back and smiled at me. While my mother-in-law and I were having this exchange, my husband began to prepare the tea in the kitchen. Something's odd. It's not like them to start saying such things out of the blue like this. What on earth is happening? As I was thinking that, my husband came back with the tea. "Come on, have some tea." Smiling, he placed the teacup in front of me. While thanking him, I was observing my husband. It seemed to me that he kept glancing at me, and my mother-in-law seemed unusually restless as well. Something is definitely off. Then I looked at the tea that my husband had prepared, and that's when I realized that my husband was up to something. There was a reason why he and my mother-in-law were being so nice to me. I thought there's no way I'm going to play into these two's hands, and I immediately started to act. I am ready. No more holding back. I picked up the teacup in front of me, and just before bringing it to my mouth, I stopped and said this to my husband. I'm sure we have some tea sweets in the fridge. Let's have your mother enjoy them as well." My husband would never usually serve tea sweets to a guest. But today, since he told me to sit and rest, there's no way he wouldn't get them. At first, my husband looked confused, but just as I thought he'd say,
Yeah, you're right."
And he headed towards the kitchen again. Then my mother-in-law also would say, "Oh, I feel bad making you go through all this trouble," and followed my husband. I did not miss that opportunity. When my husband came back, I finally brought the teacup to my mouth. My mother-in-law, who was sitting next to me, also began to drink her tea. After that, we made idle talk and showed my mother-in-law the video of today's sports festival, but my husband and mother-in-law were observing me unnaturally. Despite feeling such gazes, I calmly finished my tea. My husband, on the other hand, was watching me with a puzzled expression. I thought time would pass by without any incidents, but, as expected, something strange did happen. Suddenly, my mother-in-law, who had been chatting cheerfully until now, became increasingly pale, and the moment she began to frown, she stood up abruptly. Then, holding her stomach, my mother-in-law rushed out of the living room. The place she headed to, with her pale face, was the bathroom. "Ha ha, I knew it," was what I thought, and looked at my husband. My husband was shocked and wide-eyed. Then, after giving me a glare for a moment, he quickly followed my mother-in-law. He banged on the bathroom door, where my mother-in-law ran into and shouted,
"Hey, Mom, are you okay?"
Meanwhile, my mother-in-law seemed to be moaning in pain in the bathroom, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. Well, I have a rough idea. After a few minutes, my husband returned to the living room, leaving my mother-in-law in the bathroom. To my husband, who was biting his lips with a pale face, I said, "The tea you prepared seems to have had quite a dangerous ingredient, hasn't it?"
"So, it's really your fault after all?"
he shouted with his eyes wide open. To my husband, I replied, "You're the one who started it, aren't you? The tea you brewed for me was so suspicious that I simply switched it with your mother's teacup. That's all." When I said that,
"You suspected me? You're the worst wife."
he spat out the words, "You're the one who's the worst here." I couldn't help but burst into laughter because my husband's argument was so ridiculous. I knew something was wrong when I saw some strange powder in the teacup. "You probably put some kind of laxatives in it, didn't you?" Yes, that was what happened. Upon closer examination, there was a slight residue of something like a white powder on the rim and inside of the teacup my husband had served. If my husband was the kind of person who regularly prepared tea, I wouldn't have suspected anything like this. But my husband doesn't usually do household chores, and my mother-in-law seems to think it's natural for a wife to do everything. I couldn't believe that those two would try to give me an actual break. That's why I carefully observed my husband's actions and the tea he served. Although my husband confessed everything after I saw through his plot, his motive was incredibly trivial. Apparently, knowing that I had an important business negotiation the next day, my husband and mother-in-law conspired to sabotage my work. If things had gone according to their plan, I would have either had to cancel the negotiation due to sickness, or I would have ended up rushing to the toilet at the client's place. If that had happened, my reputation at the company might have taken a hit. Even so, it's a crime to put foreign substances into someone's drink. I wonder why my husband and mother-in-law went to such lengths to do that to me. It's simply pathetic. My husband, who had confessed everything, completely gave up and said,
"If anything happens to Mom, I'll claim damages from you."
But... Huh? What are you talking about? You're the one who should pay the damages, don't you think so? I replied with a snort. I know you've been having an affair for a while now anyways.
What?
My husband froze for a moment. Despite actually having free time, he claimed he was working and often came home late. Even on his days off, he would go out on his own, leaving no time to spend with his family. When he did happen to be at home, he was always messing around with his smartphone. Suspecting an affair from my husband's behavior, I hired an investigator to investigate him. As I expected, the results were that he was having an affair. My husband, who had become friendly with a young woman at a matchmaking party he had falsely attended as a bachelor, began dating her after lying about starting up his own company soon. The woman, who had just graduated from school and was naive to the ways of the world, likely didn't notice my husband's stupid lies. Later, my husband tried to justify his actions by saying that he wanted to regain his confidence by dating a young woman. I can picture him bragging about him becoming a CEO in the future. If he had time for an affair, he should have put more effort into his work. But maybe someone as spoiled as my husband could never really start his own business. Seeing my husband freeze and turn pale, perhaps never expecting that his affair would be discovered, I said, "So, let's get a divorce. Of course, you will have to pay child support." Even my husband must have given up, as he said,
Fine.
and then blurted out,
By the way, I know you've been secretly saving money. After the divorce, I'm taking half of that savings.
I couldn't believe his audacity. Why'd I have to hand over my assets to you? Ha! I asked while letting out a huge sigh. Don't you know that money saved before marriage is not subject to property division? Most of that savings is money I earned when I was single. Upon hearing this, my husband said,
You're lying. Aren't you earning money now?
So I decided it was time to tell him the truth. The money I earned recently, there's no way I could make savings from it. You don't have any income, so I've been using my money for living expenses. Upon hearing this, my husband was disappointed, and I added, and by the way, don't think about taking any of the furniture or appliances in this house. They were all purchased with my money. Also, this house is rented in my name, so pack up your things and leave quickly. And to my mother-in-law, who emerged from the bathroom with a pale face, I'll be reporting today's incident to my father-in-law, I said to her. To this, my mother-in-law pleaded, Please, keep it a secret from my husband. Ignoring her, I immediately contacted my father-in-law. Upon hearing the story, he was furious and immediately demanded a divorce from my mother-in-law. Meanwhile, my husband, upon learning that he would not receive any property division, finally seemed to comprehend his situation. He pleaded to me, kneeling and crying.
I don't want to break up. I can't live without you.
But it was too late for such words to change my feelings. I hired a lawyer and successfully divorced my husband. Of course, I made sure to claim child support. Since my husband had a low income, he was unable to pay the child care in a lump sum and ended up with a huge debt. Moreover, since I had filed a complaint about the laxatives in my tea, my husband and mother-in-law were convicted of assault. Although they received suspended sentences, both the mother and her son ended up with criminal records. His mistress also lost affection for him, and now my ex-husband works from morning till night to pay off his debts, and seems to be leading a miserable life with my mother-in-law, who was abandoned by my father-in-law. They tried to set me up from their petty jealousy, even though I did everything for my family, so they reaped what they sowed. On the other hand, I was promoted to leader of the sales team thanks to the great success of an important negotiation the other day. I moved out of the apartment I shared with my husband, and I am now living happily with my son in a newly rented apartment. My first marriage ended in failure, but from now on I am determined to juggle work and parenting, and I am sure to seize happiness